Was there a third property? I'll have to
Of the
take a look.
backyard.
Television guy that we're ready to start?
Thumbs up?
Got it here and I'm not seeing anything, so.
Okay.
They're on the screen. Oh, good. Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this pre-council meeting to talk about legislation to address housing inspections for rental units. I'd like to remind you that this meeting, like all meetings, is governed by the Open Meeting Act. LB 898 is posted at the back of the room. And we have from building inspection.
Yep, Chad Blaha with Building and Safety.
Thank you, Chad, for doing that. Would you please help us understand what's going on here?
Sure, yes, no problem. Thank you, council members, and for
Everybody else understands. I'm the one that's
for taking your time to come in a little early tonight to hear what we have to say about an item that is on first reading tonight, and then it'll be open for public hearing next week. And it is it's an ordinance that amends Chapter 538, which deals with a number of things, but mostly the apartment rental licensing program. But first, I kind of want to talk a little bit of why we were here and what we are currently doing during the program. I'll just summarize because a lot of you are no doubt familiar with what we do. But we do have a rental licensing program for buildings with 3 or more units currently. So if it's whether that's a house conversion into a triplex, or if it's a 12-plex building that started off as an apartment building. We license all of those, and part of that licensure is a annual inspection where our guys go in and do exterior inspections and then common space inspections, so like laundry, hallways, storage rooms, that sort of thing. The annual renewal, we do not get into the interior units, so that's kind of important later on. That annual renewal, we do not get into the interior of the departments, or interior of the apartments. Like I said, these are adopted on renewed on a 12-month cycle. There are performance-related components to the registry. If you have an apartment license with no violations, then you can skip a year with your inspections. And this was put in place back in the early 2000s, I think, to be more of a, like I said, a performance-based program. So the folks who take care of their buildings on a regular basis have a little bit of relief from that inspection, and the folks that don't then have a shorter window for getting inspected. So that was just a couple of the measures that have taken place over the years, and we feel that even though I wasn't around for that, I still feel that is a good policy and a good strategy, because it focuses our time and resources on the properties and those property owners that maybe need a little bit more attention than the majority of the property owners, commercial property owners, that do a good job taking care of their properties. Hi, John. Thank you. And so part of that was all as an example. Some of those performance-based measures included triggers that allows us to get into the individual units. So, like I said before, the annual inspection that happens regardless is just exterior and common space. Now, if we have complaints from an interior apartment on an individual building twice within a calendar year, per code, that allows us to go in and do a top-to-bottom inspection on that building. With the thought being that if you got 2 units that have problems in there, that it warrants a closer look at the whole building. And that is kind of a stair step. So when I said 2 or more, that's for 3 to 12 unit building. And so if you go to, if you have a bigger building like a 24-plex, then you need 3 complaints and so on and so forth. So the bigger the building, the more complaints that you would need to cause that the top to bottom inspection to happen. So that's the,
I'm sorry, that's the current
That's
state
the
of the
current.
law?
That's the
As
current.
long as you have 3 units or more?
yep.
3 to 12.
3, anything above 3, I think.
Anything above 3, we license, yes. And then the trigger to get into the interior units for an inspection is different based on the size of
That's
that
what I was
building.
I see.
Yes. So the smaller the building, the fewer the complaints with violations, and that's the other important. It's not just complaints. It's got to be a complaint that results in a violation. So some of the some of the other things that have happened is the neglected building registry, which isn't strictly to do with the apartment license or apartments, but can, and it's an important step that we've taken. So all of these, and that's just some of them. I didn't read word for word on this sheet here for you. You can do that, but there's other things, but those are kind of the important things that have to do with the proposed changes. You know, and building and safety, we do continually look at our processes for improvement, different ways of improving the experience for our customers and the citizens in the areas that we're assigned to look at. And to that, you know, earlier this year, we were doing that evaluation, but it also coincided with an item in the state legislature that was originated from a Omaha senator and intended to include Omaha, and Lincoln was added afterwards, a little while afterwards. But this bill would have required universal inspections on a not more than 3-year cycle for all apartment units, single family, duplex, and multifamily structures. So that would represent quite an increase in workload. And so we took a closer look at that, and actually I went down and testified at the state legislature in mostly a neutral capacity, but just to point out that Lincoln did have a robust apartment licensing program, that we do inspections, we do get into these units when those performance triggers are met. And so we were removed. Lincoln was shortly after that, Lincoln was removed from the bill. However, there was a number of tenant advocacy groups that were still interested in doing something a little more in Lincoln. So we continued our analysis and what we already do, looking at maybe a couple of different ways we can increase our involvement in some of these problem properties, the poor performing buildings and property owners. And that is kind of what you will have, what is going to be before you next week in public hearing, this amendment. Once again, we took the strategy to focus the resources on the properties that need it, not the vast majority of the landlords and properties that are okay, and those property owners that do a good job of keeping up their buildings. The changes do involve two main things. One is it creates a rental database, which would include ones and twos, a single family and duplex, but that it is only similar to the existing apartment rental program in that it collects information. It does not include any regular inspections. And then the second component basically just gives us additional triggers to get into some of these problem buildings. And so I guess with that, it kind of brings you to the last half of that second page for that first handout, where you have a heading 1 or 2. The first one is the rental registry. And essentially, we would create a database that collects the same information that we already collect for the apartment buildings, owner contact information, that sort of thing, to allow our inspectors a more direct way of getting in contact with folks who, the decision makers in regard to that property, the owners or an owner's representative, somebody who has authority to make decisions and make the necessary repairs. It's we have on, right now it's shown as a $15 one-time fee. So as long as that property owner owns that property for 5 years or for 30 years, it's $15
Is it per unit?
per
unit?
building.
Per building?
So, yes. And in this case, it's only a single family and duplex, so it would be one for the building. Yes, and like it says here, apartments or buildings with 3 or more are already licensed, so it would have no effect on those. It will be online, payable online. They would apply online. They'd have no need to even deal with us. It would be online. They could just do it there. And like I said, that item E just clarifies again that there is no planned inspections to go with this.
Pardon me, Councilman Christensen has a question
A
also.
couple of questions maybe. So how many rental units are we looking at every year right now?
Rental units.
Right.
Let me answer it a little bit. We have about 3,000 apartment licenses, so that's 3,000 buildings. And that makes up about 40,000 individual apartment units.
And last year, do you have any idea how many of those units failed inspections?
I don't have that data, how many, oftentimes there is a violation. Now, when you're talking on an annual, we don't get into the units. The only time we're in a unit is if there's a complaint.
But I
So
guess
how
I'm
many
asking,
complaints?
Not only how many complaints, how many confirmed violations do you have in an average year?
I guess, okay, we get about 1,000 to 1,300 complaints a year. Roughly, probably 80% of those result in a violation. And so those are complaints. Now, the number of violations that result from a annual inspection would add quite a bit more. I do not have those figures.
And so, and you inspect anytime a property changes hands, right?
Yep, COC.
And
Yep.
so how does the COC work in
Yep.
that fashion?
I should have mentioned that earlier. COC is one of the tools that gets us into a building to inspect from top to bottom. If it's a brand-new building, that's part of the building permit. If it changes ownership, if the apartment building changes ownership, it's essentially a new apartment license. And so they have to get what's called a certificate of compliance, and they do a top to bottom inspection on that. And I do have a number for that, and that's kind of on your other handout. Over the last 5 years, we have gotten to just under 10,000 of the individual apartment units. So close to a quarter of all of the apartment units that are in buildings over the last 5 years we've gotten into through the COC process.
So, just to dig in a little further, if I were to rent out a room in my house, would that be part of the registry and all this? Or if a basement apartment or a mother-in-law?
If it's a basement apartment and it's an apartment and there's a lease involved, then yes.
Okay.
What about first floor? Same thing, isn't it?
What do you mean?
If you had a first floor apartment, it'd be the same effect, would it not?
If you have a
Yes.
lease.
Yes, if there's a lease involved.
If you have a lease.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, okay.
You were asking
So-
about
so
basement
I'm just trying to
apartment,
explore
I was-
how far we go, or what it entails and what it doesn't. So let's say,
This does not include short-term rentals.
okay, well, let's say I bought a home for my daughter who's gonna be going to UNL. I buy this home and she lives there and a couple friends live there and they pay to live there. So is that gonna be registered?
If it's no more than 3 unrelateds in the building, there's not a violation, and technically, if there is a lease involved, I suppose it could be argued that that would count. I don't believe that's the intent, and we can certainly clarify that.
Okay.
Okay, and so that's the rental registry. Really, it's, the registry is mostly an information gathering for us to better do our jobs when we do get calls for service to those places. Item number 2, the second component to the amendment is, like I said, does deal with the apartment licensing. And so 2I starts with, it does add duplexes to an inspection program. So if we get 2 complaints from one half of the duplex in a calendar year that result in violations, that is the key. They all have to result in violations. Then if it's then we'd be authorized to go into the second unit. Then 2 and 3, these would be,
Jan,
yes.
Okay, did you say 2 violations a year, or 1 year, 1 violation?
Oh, wait a minute,
2 complaints.
one or more units, 2-family duplex.
2I, 2-1.
So if they had 10 complaints and there were no violations, nothing happens.
Correct.
If they have 10
Because we
complaints.
we're obligated to respond to any complaint, and so our inspectors would go down and.
So it's 2 complaints, not just.
2 complaints. and-
2 violations.
Violations.
Well, let me get back to you, John, on that. Let me,
So they could have just 2 complaints, that'd be 2 violations, or it could be 3 complaints. But each time you have a complaint, then you're going to inspect?
No.
well, yes, we do, we have to do that anyways. We do that today. Anytime we have a
Three or more, don't
complaint.
you?
What's that?
Does that apply to duplexes and singles?
Yeah,
or is
we,
that just 3 or more?
yes, if somebody complained about my house, I'd have to send my guys to my house to investigate, the complaint.
Thank you.
Then that's current code, that's current code today.
Yeah, because it's so common. Neighborhood associations report other homes in their neighborhood that are neglected or have critters going in and out of them, so that's, building and safety has to go in and inspect.
But I think those are external violations that most neighbors report.
That's correct.
That is,
correct.
that is correct. Now, not to get off on a tangent here, when we get into, sometimes family members will report conditions, that other family members are living in, interior, and we do show up, but, if we're just responding to the regular complaint, we still don't have authority to force our way in. We would have to have sufficient, evidence to get a warrant to go in. But yes, we would respond. Okay, so the other 2I, the additional trigger to start to get us into these buildings, like I said, right now, if we have in the same apartment building, let's do the 12-plex for an example. If we have 2 complaints in an interior unit, so that's in the living unit, that result in a violation, that triggers our authority to do an entire building inspection, all 12 units. That's the way the code exists today. What 2 does expands on that concept a little bit. If you have 2 buildings that are in 2 separate buildings in common ownership, if one building has a complaint that has a violation and the other building has a complaint that has a violation in a calendar year, the proposed amendment would give us the authority to go through both of those buildings. Now, if that owner owns 6 buildings, we don't go into all 6 buildings, it's just the 2 that had the violations. That is a common confusion with some of the folks that, that we have shared this with. So we want to make that clear, that it's not, it doesn't affect all of the properties, just the ones that have the violations.
Mr. Blaha, I
Yep.
think Councilman Christensen has an additional question.
How many additional employees would this require as we, do you have a projection if we step this up, how many more people we need?
Right now, based on this, we are not proposing an additional employee yet. We don't know exactly how often it will be triggered. We would have to look at that, and we are constantly because we're a fee-funded department, and this activity is the licensing, is fee, we're constantly looking at that.
Unrelated thing, but it
Yep.
occurred to me, let's say I'm renting one of 12 apartments in a building,
Mm-hmm.
and the threshold has been met, and we're gonna do inspections on all the apartments.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm there and I say, I don't want you coming into my apartment. Do you still have the authority to do that?
Yes. We have to do proper,
Notification?
it's not an easy thing to do because it's a pretty serious thing.
Yeah. So I was thinking about.
Yes,
okay,
because the
what-
landlord, because the authority for us to get in there is tied to that apartment license. And so therefore, it's tied to that landowner, or the property owner, the landlord. And the landlord does have authority, given proper notice, to get in there through the Landlord-Tenant Act.
Okay. So the idea was just occurring to me, what if I'm, doing some kind of nefarious activity in there and you come in, and I don't want you there, and you find evidence of a crime?
Cat
I
juggling.
mean, what happens? You didn't have a warrant. I mean, that's a question.
Legal beagle.
Yeah, and at some point, we have to say, can we let him finish and then go
Yeah,
back
I
to
see.
questions, yeah. So I think Chris is
Okay.
gonna answer your question to the best of his ability, then Chad's gonna finish up his,
I've
and
only got a couple more.
then we're gonna say.
You want me to
go
answer
first.
now? Wait, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so real quickly, and quite frankly, this item number 3 may be the biggest hitter to start with, down here, 2.3, down here where it says failure to pay required fees or penalties. And what that goes after are the apartment licensees, that struggle to pay their annual apartment renewal license fee. What this change does is clarify the process by which we, for lack of a better term, I guess, expire their renewal or their apartment license. And so if we expire their apartment license due to non-payment of that fee, then they need to reapply and start over, and they would need the COC. It's basically a new apartment license, and that gets us into the building. We already have the authority to expire those licenses. This just kind of defines that process a little bit more. And we would expect that wouldn't last very long, and it would only take one or two examples of that happening, and then they may start paying their fee. And then number 4, if there's a conviction of a one thing I should mention with 3, and there's ample notice. There's 2 notices built in there, so basically you got about 60 days from the time you're noticed to the time we would actually expire that permit. And so there is what we feel is ample notice to these license holders. Number 4 is the convicted of a housing code violation. So if there's a problem in an apartment building unit that has drug on and on and on, and to the point where we end up with a conviction, once again, they'd probably have to try to do that, then that could trigger a top-to-bottom inspection of the building. And then the last one, property owner refuses the service of notice for the violations. Basically, they refuse to accept the proper notice or acknowledge the proper noticing of the violations, either through the complaint. Is that meant to be through the complaint or the annual?
Yes.
Yes, through either inspection program. Went through that really fast. There's a lot more in the actual ordinance, but
Okay.
All right. Yes, would you address Councilman Christensen's question about
Yeah, what happens with regard to, if an inspector's in a unit and they see evidence of drug activity, for example, they aren't authorized to do anything themselves. However, once they leave and they're done with their inspection, they can, and typically, I believe would, if it's a serious-looking circumstance, report it to LPD, who then can go get their own search warrant and go back to the apartment. And Chad is correct that it would apply to all units. However, if we ran into a situation where a tenant is literally standing at the door saying, "You're not coming in under any circumstances," we're not going to force entry there. We'll go back and get an inspection warrant, which we'll still be authorized to do, and then do the inspection that way. So the fallback is always going to be to get a warrant for those kinds of circumstances.
I'm gonna go with Councilman Camp first, then Councilman Lamb.
I think,
Oh, I'm sorry, did I turn?
earlier, Mr. Christensen was asking you about the number of rental units, and I heard 40,000 or whatever. Now, did I hear that right?
In apartment buildings, so that would be the apartment buildings with 3 or more units. That does not include single-family or duplex.
Okay, so 40,000 in those. Then what is the estimate of single-family and duplexes?
The estimate is 12 to 15,000.
Right, and they're not required to be on the registry, correct?
They are required to be they would be required to be on the registry, but they don't have an annual license, and there is not an inspection program associated with those.
That would be a change in the rule. They're currently not required to be, and they would be in if this,
They would have to register.
And they are not currently on there, that's
not
correct.
currently, yes.
So that's the $15 fee.
Well,
Yes.
I've heard 11,000. 11,000 units, and that doesn't necessarily translate into 11,000 buildings. You know, it's a mixture of single-family and duplexes, so.
Since they're not currently there, I don't think we can have a really good number, can you?
The only way for us to estimate that is to compare, certain data sets, because we just don't know. We've never tracked, the number of, single-family and duplex rentals.
And I'm sorry I interrupted, Councilman Camp.
Well, and I was just
Yeah.
leading up to then also the discussion about how many potential employees you would need, inspectors you would need, because if you got 40,000 now and you have how many inspectors?
We've got 4 inspectors and a chief. Now, we have 40,000 units, but that doesn't mean we're going into 40,000 apartment buildings on a regular
I understand,
basis.
But if you add another 10,000, 11,000, as my colleague was saying, wouldn't that take at least one more person?
We're not adding 10,000, 11,000. There's no inspection requirement.
Registry.
It's just
Just
a
register.
registry.
It's just the registry.
But if you get the violations reported,
But we do that anyways today. If we get, the 11 to 15,000 is the single-family and duplexes, which we investigate every complaint on any single-family and duplex today.
have you seen the complaints increasing over recent years, or what's been the trend?
They actually have, for quite a while now, hold steady at about 1,000 to 1,300 complaints a year.
Councilwoman Lamb?
So on those 1,000 to 3,000, is that what you said?
1,000 to 1,300.
1,300 complaints, those are complaints that are always investigated?
Yep.
Okay. And so, my question too was about how many additional staff, but basically, right now, can you explain how the inspection process goes for internal inspections if you've received a complaint? From the
If-
tenant, I'm assuming.
Regardless of what type of building it is?
Well, one that,
I mean, I guess, yeah, if we receive a complaint from a tenant of a rental property of any kind, then we arrange to meet them at either the apartment building or the single family or whatever it is. And they let us in and show us the area that they're making the complaint about. And then our inspectors evaluate whether or not it's a violation or not.
and then they get cited for a violation if there is a violation.
If there's a violation, then yes, then we have,
Reinspection?
we would have to come back and to verify that the correction was made.
And so is there a fee for that inspection?
Not the first time. We will come back and look to see that to see if it's done. If it's not done after that first, right?
Correct.
Yep, thank you. Sean's my chief housing inspector. He wanted to come down here too. But if we have to go back a second time, then yes, there is a reinspection fee.
Just so it's clear, that's actually the third inspection, because you have the
Yes.
first one, and then you have the first reinspection, which is free, and then the second reinspection is where the fee starts to get charged.
Yep. So you have the initial complaint investigation, then you have the come back to see if it's done. And then if it's not done and we have to come back again, that's when we do the reinspection fee. So they get, they'd have good notice. And any property owner who receives a violation can call, email, stop in, smoke signal, whatever, ask us if they need ask us for an extension of the time to complete the work. And our inspectors are very good at working with those folks to make sure they have a reasonable time to get it done. But it's also tough because we don't want it to continue to languish.
Councilwoman Kayla Baird has some questions.
Judd, what is the problem we're trying to solve typically? What are the most common investigations that result in violations? What's happening in the community when you go out and you determine, yes, there has been a violation? Do you have data on the most common, top three? Is it mold, or what are we talking about? And then secondly, how do your inspectors determine if the problem was the responsibility of the landlord or the tenant?
Okay, the second, let me answer the second question a little bit first. The way I like to describe this is our inspectors and our department, we don't advocate for the landowner, and we don't advocate for the tenant. We advocate for the building. If there's a violation, there's a violation. And so whether or not it's the landlord's responsibility due to neglect or whatever, or if it's damage caused by the tenant, our code does not really authorize us to be influenced one way or the other in that regard.
Who gets the notice of violation?
The owner. The owner does.
Okay.
Wouldn't that make the presumption against the owner then, rather than the occupant?
What's that?
Wouldn't that make the presumption that the owner is at fault and not the tenant?
Well, if I could just, I don't think it rises to the level of presumption. It's just that it's the owner's building, and we as a city want to make sure the owner maintains the building. The owner can figure out some contractual arrangement with regard to the tenant to resolve those kinds of problems if the tenant caused the problem. But it's not up to the city to tell the tenant, you have to go fix this landlord's building. That's a complicated way of doing things. So it makes much more sense, it's much more efficient for us to initially approach the landlord and have the landlord then work it out with the tenant if the tenant is the cause of the problem, which does happen.
But really, the landlord only has, and the building owner would only have control over the common areas. I don't know many people that like a landlord coming in to inspect, unless maybe there's a filter change or something, but years ago, in my experience of renting,
I understand
that was my feeling.
you're right that tenants don't like to have landlords coming in, but at the same time, it is a landlord's building. They are responsible for it. And so all the life safety issues in particular are certainly the responsibility of the landlord, regardless of whether it's in the common area or in the units themselves.
So,
Yes, please.
so the first question, I'm not an inspector. I don't read all of their reports that come in. If any of you would like a little bit more detail on the different types of violations there are. I mean, mold is certainly one of them. What's the most prevalent? I could not answer that, but Sean would certainly be welcome to have a conversation with anybody.
Yeah,
I know you guys got a big meeting coming up here, so I don't know if you wanted.
It would be, I think, helpful for us to have good information on, as we
Okay.
evaluate the proposal to,
Tell us real quick.
yeah, if he knows it
Come on
now.
up, Sean.
If he has a,
If you have that data
Prepared.
now, if not, if you
I
could.
don't necessarily have data, just experience of.
Sean's he was an inspector for quite a few years prior to being chief, so.
So probably the most common
complaint,
complaints and violations that we receive are items like yard clutter is probably one that we receive the most complaints about.
these are strictly rental units we're talking about, not,
No, owner occupied as well. Just complaints
Aaron, did you
overall.
want to know
I'm sorry.
about internal units? Like if they have to respond to an internal unit, is that what you were asking?
Well,
what we're looking at is just rental
Yeah, I want to know
units.
what's relevant to what we're being asked to consider, so, I
And
mean, it's
then-
still interesting to know.
Yeah, and then in apartment settings, I would say smoke detectors, egress issues are probably the most prevalent things that we find. Plumbing leaks and minor electrical problems as well.
So I guess to follow up on this, I would really appreciate seeing some kind of hard saying, this is what we've got, this is how many units are in the city that we inspect currently, this is what percent, how many violations we have each year, and I'd like to know, is this, how big is this problem? Is this 10% of the units have violations a year? Is it 2%? What is it? What are we trying to solve here, and how big of a problem is it? That's the question I'd like to have answered.
Well,
Chris, you had some questions, didn't you?
I did. I think Chad gave us that answer when he started, when he told us that there are 40,000 units and 1,000 complaints that are founded, and, or 80% of those are founded.
and that was just quick guesswork.
I've heard different
Pretty close,
accounts.
yeah.
Okay, all right.
That's why I wanted to know.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Chad and Sean for being here. Chad, I think you did a good job of explaining what this is. This is real simple. It's not at all complicated. It essentially adds a registry program, and one of the main reasons for that program, for the reason there is when there are problems, who are you going to call? Okay? Somebody has a problem, you got water running, tenant doesn't know what to do about it. It's not their problem, except they got to live with it. So who's the responsible party? And that's what the registry is all about, is finding out who that person is that's responsible for the property to make sure that those issues are addressed. And then the inspection of the unit piece is, it's already there. It's being done. This just adds a few ways that could be enhanced, and that's when there are problems. If somebody has been convicted of a housing code violation by the district court, then you have the authority to go in and inspect those units. If a owner refuses service of notice from our building code people, that's a reason to go in and inspect those units. This all comes about really from what happened at the Yale Park Apartments in Omaha, where there were 500 Myanmar refugees in those units that were essentially had to be removed because of the conditions there. We don't want that here. I hear from residents for nearly a year now. I've been meeting with the South of Downtown Housing Subcommittee and the concerns that residents are voicing about the conditions there. It's not most of them. It's not most of them at all. But there are concerns about it, and we just need to make sure that people are safe and that things are taken care of, and that both landlords and tenants as well are responsible in what they do.
Councilwoman Raybold?
I have a couple questions. So have you presented these ideas to the Apartment Owners Association and the realtors, and have they provided feedback?
Cindy, did they provide feedback? Yes, they did.
They were presented to it.
We presented them once we felt there was something realistic to present. It's been presented to the Commercial Property Owners Committee of the Realtors Association. And then it's been presented to the Rioma Board separately, and then to the general membership of Rioma as well,
When did those presentations take place?
last week.
So have they had an opportunity as groups to respond? Like official, this is what our criticisms are, this is what our suggestions are to improve this. Has that process taken place?
It's presumably taking place right now.
And then another question I have, can you go into a little bit more detail on that 2.3, failure to pay required fees or penalties? You say the language or the modifications clarify the process that allows the license to expire. So what's the process now? And then what is it trying to clarify? I'm not sure.
Well,
So if you have a failure, if you send out a notification
process-
because they failed to.
the process
take a
now
fee-
is we keep bugging them to try and get them to pay their license fee for as long as it takes to get them to pay it, and it can drag on. There's not a good mechanism for forcing that to happen. And once again, this isn't the majority. It's a pretty small subgroup
Of repeat offenders, I'm guessing. Yeah.
repeat offenders that, in my opinion, there may be isolated instances where there was maybe legitimate reasons for not, but I mean, you almost have to choose not to pay them, because we do send multiple notices.
So you
to
said that,
them.
I think you said it, you give a notification and they have 60 days to pay the delinquent fees or
They
fines?
get a notice, is it 30 days prior to the actual renewal date. And then they will get another notice saying you got another, is it 30 or 60? Another 30 days, otherwise we'll,
Do a reinspection.
otherwise your renewal will, or your license will expire. So they got,
And then they understand that if, when they go out and reapply for that license, it triggers a total top to bottom inspection of however many units are in that property.
I mean, I guess I can't vouch for whether or not they understand it or not, but if they lose their, if their license expires, then yes, they would have to get a new license, and we would hopefully be able to make that clear to folks when they communicate with us, and we can't.
Is this stuff we're already doing? Is this how
No.
we're already doing it? No.
To my knowledge, I don't know that we've ever expired a.
No, and that's the purpose of that is to be able to have that leverage to be able to,
And that would
Convince people.
apply not only to those with 3 or more units,
Just 3 or more units.
just 3 or more units.
'Cause
So
we
it doesn't
don't like-
involve that single family or the duplex.
Because that's just a registry, that's not a
Got
license.
it, okay. Okay,
Councilman Camp,
thank you.
Yeah,
and then Councilman Eskridge. Yeah.
Mr. Estrich brought up, the Omaha situation, and as I recall, that was a larger apartment building. And all, and so I don't see something like that occurring in a single family or duplex. You can't cram 300 people into that. But I do know of some immigrant families that overburden an apartment just because the economies of scale in paying the rent. And so, I don't know how much a landlord can get involved in that and prevent it. I know that landlords do care. On
There's
the-
codes, aren't there codes that you can't have more than 3 unrelated individuals in a dwelling?
In a dwelling unit.
But it goes on, it exists.
Sure, well, that's
So-
a violation.
College students do it all the time.
Let him
College
finish.
immigrants, okay, so I'm trying to understand what we're trying to solve here and get at, as Ms. Theodore Baird said. Secondly, to me, I see it as a tax on the single-family and duplex. I mean, you're looking at $150,000 to $200,000 of additional amounts they're gonna have to pay at a $15 registration fee. Third, I attended a luncheon of commercial realtors last Wednesday after they'd spoken with you, and they were pretty hot under the collar. They did not favor this.
Okay.
They pointed out a number of things that they were very concerned about, and they asked if I would consider trying to put this on pending so that it could be ironed out a little bit better if they're going to go this direction. So,
Did they offer suggestions on what would be a good way to be able to get proper notification to the owner or the decision maker of that property?
they didn't
To
go
take
that
correction?
deep because the meeting had a totally different purpose, but then this came up in a discussion period.
That's why I appreciate the dialogue and the feedback, like, okay, you're hot under the collar, let's hear a solution or suggestion on how to make it so that it's acceptable, so that, you know, obviously there needs to be a decision maker on any property.
We have other questions for our experts?
2 minutes.
It sounds like we're going to have some more conversation about this. Chad, Sean, thank you both for coming forward. We appreciate that. I declare this pre-council meeting adjourned.
Great.
Thank you.
While you're all